Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to objectively unpack an academic lecture on Christian ethics by Dr. James S. Spiegel, specifically looking to understand the precise structural arguments that underpin the pro-life position. We're taking a strictly analytical look at exactly how philosophers, statisticians, and theologians construct their frameworks.
So, let's just dive right into this. Before even addressing the abortion debate directly, philosopher Don Marquis argues that we actually have to take a step back and clearly define why the act of killing itself is morally wrong. I mean, is it because it brutalizes the killer? Well, no. Marquis points out that you can actually kill someone gently. Okay, is it because the victim is going to be missed by their loved ones? Again, no, because we all agree it's still definitely wrong to kill someone who has absolutely no family or friends, so we have to isolate the exact specific mechanism of the wrongness itself.
To thoroughly analyze Dr. Spiegel's lecture, we're going to navigate through 5 distinct pillars today. First up, the valuable future theory. Second, the biological trajectory argument. Third, rebuttals and obligations. Fourth, the biblical perspective. And finally, begging the question.
Let's start with Section 1, the valuable future theory.
Here, Don Marquis does something really fascinating. He deliberately sets aside the entire concept of fetal personhood, just completely takes it off the table. Instead, he asserts that killing is wrong simply because it deprives a victim of a valuable future. It inflicts literally one of the greatest possible losses on the victim, the loss of all their future experiences, activities, and projects. By anchoring the wrongness of killing strictly to this idea of depriving someone of a future, Marquis creates a framework that leads us to some logically consistent, but honestly pretty surprising ethical conclusions.
So applying this strict metric, what happens? Well, for one, this theory implies that killing animals is prima facie wrong because, animals have potentially valuable futures. On the flip side, active euthanasia might actually be permissible in this framework. If an individual's future is only going to be racked with extreme terminal pain, you aren't actually depriving them of a valuable future. And what about contraception? Under this theory, it remains morally acceptable. Why? Because no single sperm or ovum alone possesses a combined valuable future. Until conception happens, there's just no combined entity there to deprive. But when it comes to abortion, Marquis argues it is a serious moral wrong because it undeniably stops a developing organism from experiencing its valuable future.
Moving right along to Section 2, the biological trajectory argument.
Building on that philosophical foundation, Alexander Proust shifts the focus over to unbroken biological continuity, and he centers this on a super simple universal truth. I once was a fetus. Proust argues that if it's wrong to kill an adult right now, well, it would have been equally wrong to kill that exact same organism back when it was a fetus. Why? Because you and the fetus are the exact same continuous individual organism. You just look a bit different now. In fact, Proust notes that if someone had killed you as a fetus, they would have actually deprived you of a much longer valuable future than if they were to kill you today.
Now, critics of this biological trajectory bring up a pretty interesting point. It's known as the twinning objection. They point out that roughly 1 in 260 blastocysts actually split into twins. So the thinking goes, if a blastocyst can become 2 totally different people, let's just call them Jake and Josh, how can it be considered a single distinct organism with a single valuable future before that split even happens? Well, Proust counters this by arguing that the mere possibility of an organism splitting down the line doesn't magically negate the fact that it is a genuine individual organism right now prior to the split.
Which brings us to Section 3, rebuttals and moral obligations.
Here, Christian philosopher Frank Beckwith directly rebuts some popular pro-choice arguments, starting with maternal safety statistics. You've probably heard the common argument that a first trimester abortion is 9 times safer for the mother than childbirth. 9 times safer sounds massive, right? But Beckwith mathematically shows that framing it this way is extremely misleading. When you look at the actual survival percentages, the abortion survival rate is 99.999%, while the childbirth survival rate is 99.991%. When you compare them like this, the difference is a statistically negligible 0.008%. Beckwith argues that you just cannot build a robust ethical position on a 0.008% statistical variance.
Beckwith also takes aim at Judith Jarvis Thomson's incredibly famous violinist thought experiment. If you aren't familiar, Thomson basically compares pregnancy to waking up artificially hooked up to a famous violinist in a hospital bed to keep him alive, arguing that, of course, you have the right to unhook yourself from a stranger. Beckwith argues this completely misrepresents biological reality. He says comparing an unborn child to an artificially connected stranger completely ignores the inherent natural moral obligations that parents have to their own offspring. He points out that suggesting all family duties must be entirely voluntary is fatal to the whole concept of family morality. Parents naturally incur obligations to their children simply by virtue of them being their children.
Shifting gears a bit, let's look at Section 4, the biblical perspective.
Moving into the theological realm, Dr. Spiegel outlines exactly how specific scriptures are interpreted to construct the biblical case for the pro-life view. Passages like Psalm 139 and Jeremiah 1 are consistently cited to illustrate this theological perspective, that God is intimately and intentionally involved in the meticulous creation of each human life, right from the moment of conception. The textual argument being made here is that the unborn aren't merely biological processes, they are known entities, deliberately set apart and called by God before they're even born.
And the lecture highlights just how deeply these textual interpretations dictate moral frameworks for believers. Take this really critical legal case study in Exodus 21. It describes a situation where two men are fighting and they accidentally strike a pregnant woman. The text outlines the penalties for this, but the exact moral penalty applied to the men actually depends entirely on a specific linguistic translation of what happens to the child. It's like a giant translation puzzle.
It all hinges on this one Hebrew phrase, Yetzu Yaladeha. If this phrase is translated loosely as a miscarriage, the text reads as relatively lenient regarding the loss of the fetus. However, if it's correctly translated literally as a premature live birth, meaning her child comes out, then the strict life-for-life penalty applies if that infant subsequently dies from the injury. Under that specific translation, it establishes equal legal and moral weight between the adult woman and the premature infant, completely rendering it a foundational pro-life text.
Finally, we reach Section 5, begging the question.
For a logical metacritique of this broader societal debate, ethicist Scott Ray catalogs several of the most widespread pro-choice arguments that we frequently hear. Things like the argument for bodily autonomy, the very real fear that restricting abortion leads to dangerous back-alley procedures, the heavy financial hardships placed on mothers, and the desire to prevent bringing unwanted or handicapped children into the world.
Now, Ray argues that all of these positions, as emotionally resonant or practically concerning as they absolutely are, logically commit a fallacy known as begging the question. Basically, they implicitly assume from the very outset that the fetus is not a person. Because, logically speaking, if the fetus actually possesses the exact same distinct moral rights as a fully grown adult, those secondary concerns about financial hardship or bodily autonomy become completely irrelevant to the central question of whether or not you can take that life. Those arguments really only work if you've already assumed the conclusion that the fetus isn't a person.
So what does this all mean for us? As we wrap up this explainer, I want to invite you to really critically weigh these intricate academic frameworks. Whether you're thinking about Don Marquis' valuable future, Alexander Proust's biological trajectory, or Frank Beckwith's statistical breakdown, how does taking a step back to examine the foundational structural premises of an argument completely change the way you view this entire complex debate? Think about it.